Thank you to our singers and musicians this morning. It is always good to sing, is it not? And some rousing songs were chosen, which was wonderful. The book of Esther is unique in the Bible. Do you know why? God's name is not even mentioned. There are 167 verses in this little book. 190 references to King Ahasuerus in this book, but not one reference to God. And so some people would question, how does a book like this make it into the sacred canon? Perhaps God's name may not be evident in this book, but his fingerprints can be seen, like in a crime scene. His fingerprints can be seen on every page of this story. It is a story of reversals of fortunes. You have Queen Vashti at the start of the book, demoted from the throne down to the royal harem. You have Esther, a little known girl from obscurity, promoted into the place of Queen Vashti. You have an unknown Haman suddenly becoming Prime Minister of the land, only himself to be relegated to the point of being hung like a criminal. You have Mordecai, who himself is a lowly civil servant. By the end of the story, he is the Prime Minister of the land. Indeed, it is a book of reversal of fortunes, and it is told around a series of banquets. Whether it's the banquet that the king throws at the beginning of the story, his big extravagant party, whether it's the banquet that Queen Vashti holds, whether it's the banquet that Haman and the king sit down to, having devised their evil plot, or whether it's the two banquets that Esther puts on, or finally the celebration and joyous festivities of the Jews who were delivered at the end of the story. It is a story that is woven through banquets. And the story commences with one huge, extravagant banquet that lasted for 6 months there in the royal citadel. The king invites all the prominent people from around his kingdom to come and see the vastness and the extravagance of his wealth and power. But it is an extravagant house of cards. You know what I mean by that? Have you ever tried building a house out of a deck of cards, only to have someone bump the table and it all comes crashing down? You see, King Ahasuerus' pomp and prosperity is but a deck of cards, because by the end of the first chapter, we see that despite all the extravagance and all the wealth and all the trappings, his value system comes crashing down when his wife refuses to appear before him like some cheap showgirl on display. You see, the value systems of this world, John describes, are those that are based upon the lusts of the eye, the pride of life, and the deceitfulness of men. And Vashti herself pays the high price for being a woman of principle, as anyone who does, anyone who stands up for principle in this world will pay a price. But this world will never be the same around the lives of those who stand up for principle. The world takes notice when you stand up for principle, because it goes against the grain. Perhaps you've seen that poster of a school of fish all flowing one way, and there's another little fish who's a different colour to all the others, and he's swimming in the opposite direction. When we stand up for principle, when we go against the flow, when we stand up to be counted, the world notices. So what is the historical context of the story of Esther, and why is it so important to us today. I believe it has a message that is applicable to God's people living right here at the end of time. The historical context. The Jewish people have been living in exile in Babylon for more than 70 years. The opportunities have been granted for them to return to their homeland. And some 50,000 Jews took advantage of those royal decrees that even promised financial support from the treasury of the world's largest empire of the time. But for the majority, the vast majority, for the hundreds of thousands of Jews that were scattered throughout the empire, life in Persia, Babylon as it has been, Persia as it was now, there was a change of government, the Liberals were out, Labour was in. Life as it had been in Babylon and Persia was just too good. Why would you bother to go home and endure the risks of a dangerous journey and the unknown of a country that lay in desolation, to rebuild a city that had been totally destroyed and pulled down? Why would you leave the comfort and security of home for the unknown and the inconveniences of labouring and rebuilding? And it is here that we meet the chief characters of this story, Mordecai the Jew and his young cousin, whom he raised as a daughter, Hadassah, soon to be changed her name to Esther. It's a story about a group of people who have been hiding their faith by blending in to the culture around them. They so fitted in now with the Persian culture that nobody really even knew that they were Jews. And Mordecai was able to advise his young cousin to hide her national identity. The people of God had become so complacent living in Susa that they no longer stood out as being any different to the neighbours around them. Unlike the story of Daniel and his three friends some 70 years earlier, where those young men stood out against the popular culture of their day. They stood up for what they believed in, and they wanted the whole world to know of their Jewish origins. They were proud of their Jewish ancestry and history, and proud of their God and the culture that their religion gave them. But now, some 2 generations later, the Jews living in Persia were happy to just slip under the radar and go with the flow. Perhaps they felt like nobodies in a world of somebodies. They were so overawed with the vastness of this empire and its wealth. Perhaps God and Palestine and all the things that their fathers talked about of their homeland, of their deliverance from Egypt, of their ancestors, of the law of Yahweh. Perhaps all those things seemed just a distant memory because none of those people had experienced it themselves. Indeed, very, very few of them had even seen their homeland with their own eyes. And if God was not silent in their lives, he was indeed absent from their lives. As silent as God was in this story, they were not aware of his providence in their lives. Yes, culturally they were Jewish, but only by ethnicity and not by faith. Perhaps today you find yourself culturally an Adventist, perhaps even by ethnicity, but not by faith. Does your Adventist faith still capture your imagination? Does the stories of the second coming of Jesus, of heaven and the hope that is offered to the saints, does that still capture your imagination? Is that still front and centre in your lives? Or do you find yourself living in Susa when your home is back in Jerusalem? Like frogs in a saucepan. I've never tried this, but they tell me if you put a frog in a saucepan of hot water, it will jump out immediately. But the reverse is true. If you put a frog in a saucepan of cold water and heat it slowly, the frog will stay there until it perishes in that hot water. Like frogs in a saucepan, the Jews living in Susa were facing an imminent death, and they were totally unaware of it. You see, they were soon to be confronted with a challenge that would be a matter of life and death. God had given them the opportunity to leave Persia and return to their homeland, but only a very small minority had taken advantage of that opportunity. You see, these people had a reputation for being alive, like the church in Sardis in the book of Revelation. They had a reputation for being alive, but they were dead. Their faith was dead. Their God was dead. They were complacent, living in Susa. But God, in his awesome grace, was about to do something on their behalf. In spite of their spiritual lethargy, God was about to deliver them in a very powerful way, and they weren't even aware of it. That is God's grace to his people. God has a message to you and I today. In the book of Revelation, chapter 3, to the church in Laodicea, God has a message for you and I. Wake up to your spiritual condition because you're so complacent living in Susa. We need to be rebuilding Jerusalem, but we are living in Susa. And there in Susa that day, something happened that got Mordecai's attention and made him sit up. The story is told that many years ago, when the only means of telecommunication was Morse code, ... dash, ... dash, dash, that a man responded to an advertisement in the newspaper. A large telecommunications company were looking for a signal operator to man one of their important stations in a city. And he had turned up for the interview. And when he got there, there was a sign on the front desk that says, "Please take this form and fill it out, and you will be called in due course." The room was already full of other people. It was the equivalent of a telephone exchange today. There were clatters and noises going on all around in this building, as Morse code was the only means of telecommunication in those days. And as this young man sat in that reception area and began to fill out the form, he paused after about a minute. He listened for another minute. And then he got up out of his chair and walked straight through the door behind the front counter and closed it behind him. All the other people in the room looked at each other as if to say, the audacity of it all. He just walked into the manager's office. A moment later, the manager came out and said to the rest of the people who had come for the job interview, "Thank you, gentlemen, for turning up. Your time will no longer be required. The position has been filled." And they all asked, "How could that be? We haven't even had an interview." He said the interview was the sound of the Morse code in the room. And the message was, if you can hear this and understand it, come through the door. Mordecai heard a message one day when he was at work that made him sit up and take notice. In Esther chapter 3, we learn that after the events surrounding Queen Esther's sudden rise to the throne, very briefly just beforehand, Mordecai uncovers Mordecai's job. He had a job at the king's gate. It was a position of little importance, but it placed him in a spot where he happened to overhear two of the king's guards planning an assassination attempt. And of course, the story was investigated, found to be true, and the 2 guards were put to death. That seemed to be the end of the matter. And chapter 3 begins with these words. After these events, King Xerxes honoured Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and elevating him and giving him a seat of honour higher than all the other nobles. And all the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honour to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honour. What was it that made Mordecai sit up and take notice? There are only 2 people in this book whose names have a genealogy attached to them. We are introduced to Mordecai in chapter 2, and we are told that he is from the tribe of Benjamin, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish. Kish was the father of King Saul. Okay, keep that in mind. Haman, the son of Hammedatha, was an Agagite. He was a descendant of King Agag. And Saul had been given a commission to go and annihilate the Amalekites, whose king was Agag. And Saul had failed to carry out that task. Well, he let Agag live. This was a 700-year-old family feud, because the moment Mordecai realised Haman's ancestry, he knew he was in big trouble. Not only would he not bow down to Haman because of his refusal to honour anyone except God, but he would not bow down to this man because he knew he was a mortal enemy. And so Mordecai finds himself sitting at the gate. And the other royal officials around him, the other public servants around Mordecai, say to him day after day, "Why is it that you disobey the king's command? Why don't you comply? Why don't you fit in with the rest of us? All you've got to do is bow the knee. He won't even know." But Mordecai refused to honour Haman. And it wasn't until his fellow workmates brought it to Haman's attention that Mordecai wasn't kneeling down, that Haman was even aware of this. But the moment Haman found out who it was, why he wouldn't bow down, and his ancestry, Haman consoled himself with the thought not only of dealing with Mordecai, this was payback time. He was now in the position of being the highest authority in the land next to the king. Haman is about to make sure that every Jew pays for Mordecai's disobedience. And so he goes to the king. And we are told that before he goes into the king, that they cast the lot. They cast the pur, as it's called. Who would they be? He hasn't even gone in. He's already made up his mind what he's going to do to these people. He hasn't gone into the king with his request, but they have cast the lot. Who would they be, do you think? He has gone to the magicians and astrologers in the land who worship demons. There are satanic forces in the land that were more than happy to cast the lot on Haman's behalf against the Jewish people. And so they cast the lot. And then Haman goes in before the king, and I want you to notice these words, and I want you to let these words sink in this morning. There is a certain people, dispersed and scattered among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom, whose customs are different from all those of all other people, and who do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will put 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury for the men to carry out this business. And notice what the king does next. the king took off his signet ring and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. Keep the money, the king said to Haman, and do with these people as you please. Haman had the king's signet ring. That was a blank check. He could do what he liked with that ring. The highest authority in the land. You see, there were satanic forces that were ready and waiting just for their opportunity to seek to destroy the Jewish people. Why would that be? Why would that be? These are the people that preserved a knowledge of the living God. They preserved a knowledge of his law. And they preserved the knowledge of the coming Messiah. There were satanic forces in this world that were seeking to wipe out God's people. And so the decree is published in every language, in every tongue, throughout the empire. And couriers take the decree. And the decree is that the enemies of the Jews can assemble on the 13th day of the 12th month to kill and annihilate and plunder the goods of the Jewish people. And the Bible tells us that the citadel of Susa was bewildered, and all the people wondered what was going to come of all this. And chapter 3 finishes with Haman and the king sitting down to drink. There's another banquet for you. Mordecai knows now why his little cousin has been elevated to the position of the queen of the largest empire of the world. Perhaps like many other parents, he lamented the day the knock came on the door. We understand you have a young woman, a young maiden in your home. Perhaps it was the day that they all dreaded. And she was carted off to join the royal harem. Perhaps they wept and cried and prayed for her protection. And finally, they would have rejoiced when they heard that she had been crowned queen of the empire. And now Mordecai knows why Esther is there. Because he says to her, who knows, but you have come to this position for such a time as this. And Esther herself was used to the good life. She had grown up in Susa as well, like everybody else. She had managed to hide her national identity, her religious identity, her faith in God perhaps. But now she was placed in a position where she knew she had no other choice but to throw in her lot with the people of God. As Moses had done, perhaps 1,000 years earlier, he knew he had come to a place in his life where he had to throw in his lot with the people of God. And so she sent a message to her cousin. I like to call her uncle because of the age difference, but anyway. Sends a message to her cousin, asking him to gather the Jews that live in Susa for 3 days of fasting and prayer, while she herself and her maids would also pray. And she says, if I perish, I perish. She had come to the point in her life where she knew that her life was not in her own hands, but it was in God's hands. If I perish, I perish. She was willing to speak up on behalf of her people because she could not sit by idly and do nothing for their deliverance. Notice that she calls for community to pray around her. She doesn't do this on her own. She invites the community of faith to pray with her. And in that fasting and prayer, she learns to still her soul that she may hear the voice of God. A story is told of years ago, in the days before refrigeration. Some of you are old enough to remember that. where there were icemen who came around with blocks of ice. They wore big leather pads on their shoulders. And probably they had earmuffs, I don't know. But they carried those big blocks of ice. They came around and they would deliver the ice. But to keep the ice blocks from sticking together at the iceworks, they would cover them with sawdust. And it would allow them to slip the ice blocks in and out of the cart that they were carried around in. And the story is told of two men working in the ice factory, coating the blocks of sawdust and laying them up, ready for transport. And one of the men was back in the days when men used to wear those gold watches on a little chain on their waistcoat. In his activity of the day, one of the men had knocked his gold watch off his chain. And there, amongst all the sawdust on the floor, who would know where his gold watch was? They had a young boy that used to work with them. Back in the days when children finished school at the age of 12, if they weren't smart. And the young boy's job was to clean up the sawdust when the men had finished their work for the day. And he thought to himself, I know how to find that watch. So while the men were sitting down outside having their lunch, he closed all the doors and he laid down in the sawdust and he listened for the ticking of a clock, of a watch. And he found the watch hidden amongst that sawdust. And sometimes in our own lives, we need to get to the point where we have stilled our soul enough to hear the voice of God. Remove the clutter and the clamour of the world around us to put those things out that we may hear the voice of God speaking to us. And Esther was able to do this. And of course, the children reenacted her daring appearance before the king for you this morning. And the king knew that something very important must have inspired Esther to take the risk of stepping into his judgment hall unannounced. That could cost her her life. He knew something very important must be on her mind. And so, of course, you know the story. She invites he and only Haman to a banquet she had prepared. But Esther had learned to listen to God's voice. And a little voice was telling her, now's not the right time. Just wait. Just wait one more day. And so the king, in his anxious enthusiasm to find out what it is that's troubling Esther, says what many of the kings in the Bible said, what will it be? Up to half my kingdom. Let it be granted you. And she's about to answer. But something, the little voice inside says, not now. Wait. She says, my request is that the king and Haman come to the banquet again tomorrow that I have prepared for them. So Haman goes home, high in spirits, as you know, leaves the palace, and once again he has to walk past his archenemy, Mordecai. And when he gets home, he says to his family, you know what? I'm the smartest guy in the land, I'm the richest guy in the land, and I'm the only guy in the land that the queen invited to a private banquet. And you would think, with all that outward appearance of success, that he would be the happiest man in the world. But he was the most miserable man in the world, because he could even admit to his own friends and family, but all of this gives me no pleasure while I see that Jew, Mordecai, sitting at the gate. And his family say, why are you even bothering with this little Jew? Just build some gallows and hang him on it and go to the party and be happy. He likes that idea. And so that night he has some gallows built. Proverbs 21 verse 1 tells us that the heart of the king is like water in God's hand. He can direct the heart of the king. And that night the king cannot sleep. Perhaps he's intrigued by Esther's request. Perhaps it's just troubling his mind. What is it that's so important to her that she should risk her life and that she should invite us to these banquets? Whatever it is, the king cannot sleep. And so rather than count sheep or look at the stars, he asked for the royal record to be brought in and read to him. Perhaps this will put me off to sleep, reading government documentation and business meeting minutes. And as the story has been read to him that evening, that night, it's more than just coincidence, it's providence. That the story of his deliverance from Mordecai's faithfulness, the story of the two men that had proposed to assassinate him, is read to him. And at the end of the story, the reader goes on to the next story, and the king goes, wait, stop. What was done for this man? How was he rewarded? No reward is recorded, sire. By now, it's almost dawn, and he hears footsteps out in the courtyard. Who is this that's come so early to disturb my peace? And it's Haman. Haman's got up early because he's going to get the dirty business done early. He's going to get Mordecai hung on those gallows that he built, and then he's going to go and enjoy his day. What a fascinating story. What a story of ironic reversal. Because the king asks Haman, what should be done for the man the king wants to honour? And Haman is so self-absorbed, so self-centred, that he's so far up himself he can't think of anybody who the king would want to honour more than him. And so you know the list that he gives. Put him on a gown on him the king has worn, a crown on his head, a horse that the king has ridden, and have him led through the streets by one of the king's most noble princes, proclaiming this is what will be done for the man the king wants to honour. Little did Mordecai have any idea what was coming next. Sorry, did Haman have any idea what was coming next? Go, said the king, do everything you have said. Do not omit anything, but go and do it for Mordecai the Jew. If Haman was a balloon, you could have popped him right then. The very man that he had sought to destroy, he now had to lead through the streets of Susa, proclaiming this is what will be done for the man the king wants to honour. Now, everyone in Susa knew about his plot to get rid of Mordecai and the Jews. Everybody would have been laughing, rolling in the ground, laughing their heads off at the reversal of fortunes that had taken place. And there at the second banquet that day, and he rushes home. He rushes home to tell his family. Chapter 6. He rushes home with his head covered in shame. Pulls the hat right down, pulls his hoodie on, puts the hat right down around his eyes. He rushes home in shame because to walk through those streets again would have brought humiliation and laughter from the crowds. And when he gets home, he tells his family and his wife everything that's happened. And notice the words of Zeresh, his wife. Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, she can already see the writing on the wall. And my kids have a reenacted story of this. It's been done. About a 20-minute DVD, half-hour DVD. And in the story, she says to her servants, pack my bags. She can see his downfall has already started. And since Mordecai is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. At the second banquet, Haman is exposed and, of course, hung on the very gallows that he had built for Mordecai. Haman's estate is given to Esther, and Mordecai is promoted to the very office that he once held. And in case you wonder how much wealth Esther inherited that day, Haman was prepared to put 1,000 talents of silver, which is 350 metric tons of silver, into the royal treasury to carry out his dastardly deed. That was just spare cash to him. 350 metric tons of silver. That's how big the estate that Esther inherited. But the story is not over. Esther appears before the king again. Chapter 8. That same day, King Xerxes gave Esther Queen Esther, the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged to him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, which he had devised against the Jews. And the king extended the golden scepter to Esther, and she rose and stood before him. This was the second time she'd gone in to the throne hall in the palace, and he had extended the golden scepter again. Deliverance is wrought for God's people because a new decree is pronounced where the Jewish people throughout the provinces of the empire are allowed to assemble on the same day to defend themselves. And there is much rejoicing amidst God's people for the deliverance that he has wrought at the 11th hour in a way that no one could have ever possibly imagined. I want to suggest to you this morning that we are living in a time when God is going to deliver his people at the 11th hour by ways that we couldn't even possibly imagine. Writing on this story in the book Prophets and Kings, Ellen White tells us that in the little company of Sabbath keepers in this world, the enemies of God and the enemies of the Sabbath see a Mordecai sitting at the gate. And the presence of that Mordecai sitting at the gate, as much as it was a rebuke to Haman and his murderous designs, the presence of Sabbath-keeping people in this world is a thorn in the side of all of those who hate God and hate his law. Revelation chapter 12 tells us that the devil, the dragon, is furious with the woman and her offspring, and he goes off to make war, to make plans. He goes off to make war against those who hold the commandments of Jesus, the commandments of God and the testimony of Jesus. And should you even doubt how that will transpire, in Revelation chapter 13 we learn that the very beasts that come up out of the sea and the land are bent on nothing else but forcing everyone to worship themselves at the cost of the lives of people who do not bow the knee to the image, to the beast. We are not talking about airy-fairy stories here, people. We are talking about life and death matters, because at the moment you and I are like frogs in a saucepan that's heating up around us. And if we're not spiritually aware, we're going to be cooked. And just as the sound of that ticking Morse code got the attention of that young man that day, there are things happening in our world today that should grab our attention and make us sit up and notice where we are and the times that we are living in. It has been said that we live in the days of the toes of Nebuchadnezzar's image. And for a long time I've said to people, we live in the days of the toenails. But more recently I've come to think, we live in the days of the yellow bit on the end of the nail. That's how close we are to the end of time. I'll tell you why I wanted to share this with you this morning. My children have a fascination for the story of Queen Esther. And so it was current in my mind. And 2 weeks ago, for some time, I've been watching the changing attitudes in our culture. The changing attitudes towards minority groups. And we would say that many of those attitudes are justified, because there's one particular minority group within our society that all of us fear. There are people we don't understand. They come from a culture we don't understand. They speak a language we don't understand. And they keep amongst themselves. But we fear these people because their compatriots in other parts of the world are prepared to strap dynamite to their chests and walk into shopping centres and obliterate the lives of scores and scores of people. And we don't know what our own minority groups in Australia are capable of worth doing. And so there are changing attitudes within our culture towards minority groups. I perhaps first noticed this. Who remembers the Cronulla riots some 12 years ago? The Cronulla riots was a turning point in Australian history and culture. And so ever since then, and ever since the so-called war on terror that our American friends have masterminded and are happy to carry out, the so-called war on terror, we've developed to the point where we are willing to give up our freedoms in the names of national security. And in a time of war, that is quite normal. When war is declared between countries, you and I no longer have any rights. We are at the disposal of the government. Where war is declared. But here we have a war of ideologies. And laws are being passed that are taking away our freedoms all the time. Laws that should make us sit up and take notice. And so 2 weeks ago, while I was driving in the car and listening to the news on the radio, I heard our Prime Minister say that he was going to push for laws to be brought in. We already have laws that mean the police can hold people for up to a fortnight without charging them. You can be held in the watch house at the police station for up to a fortnight. That freedom has been taken away. Once upon a time, you had to be charged with something before you could be held. Now you can be held without any charges being laid. Now they want to bring in a law. And the Attorney General has taken it to the state Attorney Generals in this country. They want to bring in a law that even if someone is convicted of terrorism charges, and even if they have served their time in prison, and this was the wording that the Prime Minister uses, they want to pass a law that they can keep people in prison indefinitely if society deems that they are not fit or suitable to be released. Now for me, as a Seventh-day Adventist, that was like an alarm clock going off, and it made me sit up and take notice. Because it shook me out of my lethargy. It made me realise the times that we are living in. And we would say to each other this morning, surely that can't happen in our sophisticated culture. That can't be true. But it is happening, people. And one day, the animosity that is currently directed towards Islam and Islamic people, one day, that animosity is going to be directed towards any minority group within our culture that doesn't toe the line. And if we as Seventh-day Adventists believe, and I fully do, if we are correct in our understanding of Revelation chapter 13, eventually one day that animosity is going to be turned upon God's Sabbath-keeping people. And that time that we are facing will be no Sunday afternoon picnic in the park. Jesus described it as a time like no other. A time like no other. Is that a wake-up call to you this morning? Because it was to me when I heard that on the radio. Perhaps those laws will sit there dormant for a few years. I don't know. But they're there and they can be used at any time. In the days of Mordecai and Esther and Ahasuerus and Haman, there were satanic forces that were positioning themselves to destroy the people of God and to obliterate any knowledge of the true God from this planet. There are forces at play in our society today that we're not even aware of that are positioning themselves to destroy God's people again. Let's not kid ourselves. And just as God can miraculously deliver his people back then, God can miraculously deliver his people today. Do you believe that? Because if you don't have that confidence, if you don't have that assurance, how are you going to stand up against the overwhelming forces? And Ellen White says there will be overwhelming forces that will be brought to bear against the people of God. Go home and read that little chapter in Prophets and Kings this afternoon if you want to know. We have to stay. We have to stay. Now is not the time to abandon our Advent faith. Now is the time to hang on. The story is told by Henri Charrier, a French criminal. In his book Papillon, was incarcerated on Devil's Island of French Equatorial Guinea, a place where no one had ever escaped from before. But Henri was not a person to take imprisonment easily lying down, and he had any opportunity to escape. He tried. Finally, he met up with an old prisoner, a Chinaman, who told him, if you want to get off this island, you're going to have to float off. There's no other way. He said, but when the currents take you to the mainland and the waves push you up on the shore, make sure you stay on the raft. If you get off the raft, the quicksand will suck you in. He said, you must wait for the high tide to throw you up onto the very high part of the beach, and then you'll be safe. Henri and his friend Sylvain made their plans on a moonless night. They'd secretly gathered a collection of coconuts that they'd put together in some bags, and using these coconuts as rafts on that moonless night, they threw themselves into the raging surf that was around Devil's Island. And pretty soon the ocean currents pulled them away, and for 2 days they drifted out at sea, and eventually the tides brought them in to the coast. It was low tide, and the waves dumped them on the sand at low tide. They were separated by some 100 metres, and Henri lay there, and he looked over and he saw his friend Sylvain trying to get up. His throat was dry and parched from 2 days of being out at sea with no water to drink. He couldn't yell at his friend to stay on the raft. Sylvain tried to walk up the beach, and then he began to sink into the quicksand. And all Henri could do was sit there and watch his friend disappear under the sand. For 6 hours, he lay there in the hot, hot sun until the tide changed and eventually carried his little raft and threw him on to the top of the beach. We may look at the things that are happening around us in the world. We may even look at our own church and lament its current position, our Laodicean attitude. And we may think it's time to get off the raft. I want to tell you this morning, you must stay on this raft, because to get off, to get out into the world, is nothing but quicksand. In the days of Queen Esther, the Jews celebrated their deliverance, and Mordecai instituted a national festival. They would always remember this event in their cultural history. And the days of Purim, the Feast of Purim, is still celebrated by Jews today around the world. It's a time of celebration of who they are as a people. And the Jewish rabbis have a saying that one day all other festivities will cease, but the festival of Purim will be celebrated for eternity. One day, you and I are going to be delivered. And when we get to heaven, all the other things that we celebrate now in this world are going to be forgotten. But we are always going to remember the deliverance that God has sought for his people. Indeed, we will celebrate Purim forever. May God bless you.